George Strait hears a boy singing his song in the subway. What he does moves the passengers. The screeching sound of metal against metal filled the crowded subway car as the train pulled into the 14th Street station. Among the sea of tired faces and worn expressions, a small figure clutched an old guitar case against his chest, his dark eyes scanning the diverse crowd of New Yorkers heading home after another exhausting Tuesday. Miguel Silva, barely 12 years old, took a deep breath and whispered a silent prayer in Portuguese before opening the battered case that had once belonged to his grandfather. The guitar inside was far from perfect. Its worn wooden body bore scratches and scuff marks from years of use, the strings slightly rusted, but still capable of producing the sweet melodies that had become Miguel's refuge from a world that seemed determined to test his young spirit at every turn. As he carefully lifted the instrument, his small fingers naturally found their positions on the fretboard, muscle memory guiding him to the chords his father had taught him during those precious evening lessons that now felt like distant dreams. 6 months had passed since Roberto Silva's life was cut short in a construction accident that left his family shattered and struggling to survive in one of the most expensive cities in the world. The man who had immigrated from Brazil with nothing but hope and determination, who had worked 16-hour days to provide for his wife and son, was gone in an instant when scaffolding collapsed at the Manhattan building site where he labored. As a construction worker, Miguel's mother, Lucia, now worked 3 different cleaning jobs just to keep their small apartment in Queens. She left before sunrise and rarely returned before midnight, her hands raw from harsh chemicals and her back aching from countless hours spent scrubbing floors and cleaning toilets for people who barely acknowledged her existence. The medical bills from Roberto's accident had drained their meager savings, and despite her relentless efforts, the monthly rent remained a constant source of anxiety that kept her awake during the few hours she had for rest. The young boy had discovered that his musical performances in the subway could help supplement his mother's income, earning anywhere from $20 to $40 on a good day. But for Miguel, the money was secondary to something far more profound and meaningful. Every time he played his father's favorite country songs, he felt Roberto's presence beside him, guiding his fingers across the strings and whispering encouragement in his ear. If you're watching this story unfold and feeling moved by Miguel's determination, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us, and we'd love to hear your thoughts about this incredible journey we're about to witness together. Roberto Silva had been an unusual Brazilian immigrant in many ways. While most of his compatriots gravitated towards samba, bossa nova, or the pulsating rhythms of funk karaoke, Roberto had fallen deeply in love with American country music during his first year in the United States. He discovered the genre quite by accident when a co-worker at his construction job played George Strait's greatest hits album during their lunch break. Something about the honest storytelling, the themes of hard work and family values, and the raw emotional authenticity of country music resonated with Roberto's own experiences as an immigrant fighting to build a better life for his family. Night after night, Roberto would return home exhausted but energized, teaching Miguel the chords to classic country songs on the old guitar that had belonged to his own father back in São Paulo. "Music is the universal language, meu filho," Roberto would say in his heavily accented English, mixing Portuguese endearments with his adopted country's tongue. "When you play from the heart, people understand, no matter where they come from or what language they speak." Those evening lessons became sacred rituals for father and son. Roberto would demonstrate the chord progressions while Miguel watched with intense concentration, absorbing not just the technical aspects, but the emotional weight behind each song. They would sing together in the small kitchen of their apartment, their voices harmonizing beautifully despite Roberto's broken English and Miguel's still developing vocal cords. Amarillo by Morning became their favorite song to play together. Roberto loved the story of a cowboy's resilience and determination, seeing parallels to his own journey as an immigrant worker. This song, Miguel, it's about never giving up, about getting back up every time life knocks you down, he would explain while strumming the opening chords. The cowboy in this song, he loses everything but keeps going. That's what we do, we keep going. Now, sitting in the subway car with commuters shuffling around him, Miguel prepared to honor his father's memory in the only way he knew how. The familiar weight of the guitar in his lap brought comfort, but it also carried the tremendous responsibility of keeping Roberto's spirit alive through music. Every performance was both a tribute and a prayer, a way of maintaining the connection between father and son that death had tried to sever. The train car was particularly crowded that evening, filled with the usual mixture of office workers, students, and service industry employees heading home after long shifts. Most passengers were absorbed in their smartphones, earbuds blocking out the world around them, creating islands of isolation in the cramped space. Others stared blankly ahead, their faces reflecting the exhaustion and stress of urban life in one of the world's most demanding cities. Miguel had learned to read the crowd before beginning his performances. Some days, the passengers seemed more receptive to music, occasionally dropping coins into his guitar case or offering encouraging smiles. Other days, he encountered hostility or indifference that could crush his young spirit. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't quite identify. As the train entered the tunnel between stations, Miguel positioned his small amplifier beside his feet and adjusted the guitar strap across his shoulder. The device was a simple battery-powered speaker that his mother had purchased at a pawn shop. Its sound quality poor, but sufficient for the intimate acoustics of a subway car. He had learned to work within its limitations, using his natural vocal projection and the guitar's inherent resonance to create a fuller sound than the cheap equipment should have been capable of producing. Taking one final deep breath, Miguel closed his eyes and began to strum the opening chords of Amarillo by Morning. The familiar melody filled the car, cutting through the mechanical sounds of the train and the murmur of conversations. His voice, clear and surprisingly mature for his age, began to tell the story of resilience that had meant so much to his father. The transformation in the subway car was immediate and profound. Conversations gradually faded as passengers turned their attention to the unexpected performance. Smartphones were lowered, earbuds removed, and for a brief moment, the diverse group of strangers became a unified audience, connected by the universal language of music that Roberto had always believed in. What none of them knew, including Miguel himself, was that among the crowd of anonymous commuters sat a figure whose presence would soon transform this simple performance into something extraordinary. Hidden behind dark sunglasses and a simple baseball cap, observing the young performer with growing interest and recognition, was someone whose own voice had made Amarillo by Morning a country music legend. The next few minutes would change Miguel Silva's life forever, though he continued to sing with his eyes closed, lost in the memory of his father and unaware that destiny was about to intervene in the most unexpected way possible. Miguel's voice soared through the final verse of Amarillo by Morning, each word carrying the weight of his father's memory and his own desperate hope for a better future. As the last notes faded into the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels, a few passengers began to applaud softly, their faces showing genuine appreciation for the unexpected musical interlude that had broken through their evening routine. However, not everyone in the car was moved by the performance. Near the center of the subway car, a group of 3 teenagers who appeared to be returning from school began to whisper among themselves, their voices gradually becoming louder and more audible to those sitting nearby. "Did you hear that accent?" sneered the tallest of the three, a lanky boy with an expensive backpack and designer sneakers that probably cost more than Miguel's family spent on groceries in a month. "What's some Brazilian kid doing singing cowboy songs? Doesn't he know that's not his culture?" His companion, a girl with perfectly styled hair and a smartphone that never left her hand, giggled maliciously while recording Miguel with her camera. "This is so cringe. I'm totally posting this on my story. Look at that cheap guitar, and did you see his clothes? He's probably here illegally anyway." The third member of their group, emboldened by his friend's cruelty, raised his voice deliberately to ensure Miguel could hear every word. "Hey kid, you know there are mariachi songs you could play instead, right? You know, music that actually matches where you come from? Country music is for real Americans, not for people like you." Miguel's fingers froze on the guitar strings. The warmth and connection he had felt while performing evaporated instantly, replaced by a familiar burning sensation in his chest that he had experienced too many times since arriving in New York. The sting of discrimination and prejudice was not new to him, but it never became easier to bear, especially when it attacked something as sacred as his musical tribute to his father. Lucia, who had been watching her son perform with pride and quiet tears in her eyes, felt her maternal instincts surge with protective anger. She had endured countless humiliations in her own daily life, from employers who treated her as invisible, to strangers who made assumptions about her intelligence based solely on her accent. But watching her young son become the target of such cruelty was more than her heart could bear. "Miguel, vamos embora," she whispered urgently in Portuguese, her voice shaking with emotion and embarrassment. "Let's go, meu filho. We don't need to stay here and listen to this." But the teenagers were not finished with their verbal assault. The girl with the smartphone had posted Miguel's video online with a mocking caption, and the immediate likes and laughing emojis from her followers seemed to fuel her confidence. "Oh my God, look how many people think this is hilarious. Someone should tell him that playing dress-up cowboy doesn't make him American." Their leader, sensing that he had an audience and emboldened by what he perceived as silence from the other passengers, decided to escalate his attack. "Seriously, though, this is what's wrong with this country. People come here and think they can just take over our culture. Next thing you know, he'll be claiming he invented country music." The words hit Miguel like physical blows. Every cruel syllable reminded him of the challenges his family had faced since arriving in America, the countless times they had been made to feel like outsiders in a country they desperately wanted to call home. His father had always taught him to respond to prejudice with dignity and grace, but at 12 years old, the weight of that responsibility felt overwhelming. An elderly businessman sitting 2 seats away looked up from his newspaper with visible irritation, but his annoyance was directed at Miguel rather than the teenagers who were tormenting him. "Excuse me, son," he said in a stern voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is public transportation, not a concert hall. Some of us are trying to rest after a long day at work. Could you please stop the noise?" The businessman's words felt like a final judgment, validating the teenager's cruel assessment and transforming Miguel's heartfelt tribute into mere noise that disturbed the peace. The young boy's eyes filled with tears that he fought desperately to contain, not wanting to give his tormentors the satisfaction of seeing him break down completely. Several other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their silence serving as tacit approval of the harassment taking place before their eyes. The bystander effect was in full force, with each person assuming that someone else would intervene or that the situation would resolve itself without their involvement. The subway car, which moments before had been united by music, was now divided by cowardice and indifference. Miguel began to carefully place his guitar back in its case, his small hands trembling slightly as he avoided making eye contact with anyone around him. The weight of disappointment was crushing, not just for himself, but for the memory of his father, who had believed so deeply in the power of music to bridge cultural divides and bring people together. "That's right," the teenage girl called out, mockingly. "Pack it up and go back to where you came from. Maybe try learning some music that actually belongs to your people." Lucia could no longer contain her emotions. Standing up from her seat with as much dignity as she could muster, she placed a protective hand on her son's shoulder and spoke in careful, accented English. "My son play beautiful music. His father teach him before he die. You no understand what music mean to our family." Her broken English, spoken with the vulnerability of someone using a second language under stress, only provided more ammunition for the cruel teenagers. "Oh, great," the tall boy laughed. "Now we get the whole sub-story. Let me guess, they're here for a better life, right? That's what they all say." But their laughter was interrupted by movement from the back of the car. A figure who had been sitting quietly in the corner, wearing dark sunglasses and a simple baseball cap pulled low over his face, slowly rose from his seat. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who had spent decades under stage lights, and the quiet confidence of a person who had faced down much larger crowds than a single subway car. The man removed his sunglasses deliberately, revealing piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the scene unfolding before him. As he stepped forward, several passengers gasped in recognition, though they seemed unsure whether to believe what their eyes were telling them. The face was familiar from album covers and concert footage, aged but unmistakable. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, had been sitting in that subway car the entire time, witnessing both Miguel's beautiful performance and the ugly display of prejudice that followed. His jaw was set with quiet determination, and his eyes held the same intensity that had commanded respect from millions of fans throughout his legendary career. The teenagers' laughter died in their throats as they realized that their mockery had been observed by someone whose opinion carried infinitely more weight than their social media followers. The businessman with the newspaper looked up with sudden interest, recognizing that the dynamics in the car had shifted dramatically. Miguel, still focused on packing his guitar, had not yet noticed the approaching figure. But Lucia's eyes widened with shock and disbelief as she recognized the man walking toward them. Her heart began to race as she realized that her son's performance had been witnessed by the very artist whose songs had meant so much to her late husband, the singer whose music had provided the soundtrack to their family's most precious memories. George Strait stopped directly in front of Miguel's seat, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the car. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation and the electricity of a moment that everyone sensed would be remembered long after the train reached its destination. What happened next would either validate the cruel assessment of the teenagers or prove that talent and heart transcend all artificial boundaries. The king of country music was about to render his judgment, and Miguel Silva's future hung in the balance. The subway car fell into an almost supernatural silence as George Strait stood before Miguel, his legendary presence transforming the mundane commuter space into something approaching hallowed ground. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels seemed to fade into background noise as every passenger held their breath, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Son," George said in his distinctive Texas drawl, his voice carrying the same warmth and authenticity that had made him beloved by millions of fans worldwide. "That was one of the most beautiful renditions of my song I've ever heard." Miguel looked up from his guitar case, his tear-filled eyes widening in disbelief as he processed the face before him. The features were unmistakable despite the simple disguise, the same face that graced the album covers his father had collected so lovingly. For a moment, the young boy wondered if grief and stress had finally caused him to hallucinate, conjuring his musical hero from thin air. "Mr. Strait?" Miguel whispered in heavily accented English, his voice barely audible above the train's mechanical symphony. "Is it really you?" The country music legend smiled with genuine warmth, the same expression that had charmed audiences from honky-tonk bars to sold-out stadiums for over 4 decades. "Yes, it is, son. And I want you to know that your father would be incredibly proud of what I just heard. You've got something special, something that can't be taught or manufactured." Lucia gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth as the reality of the situation began to sink in. The man whose music had provided the soundtrack to her husband's dreams, whose songs had filled their small apartment with hope and joy, during Roberto's lifetime, was standing inches away from her son, offering words of encouragement that seemed to come directly from heaven. The teenagers who had been tormenting Miguel suddenly found themselves in an impossible position. Their cruel mockery had been delivered in the presence of the very artist they had claimed Miguel had no right to perform. The tall boy's face drained of color as he realized that his words about real Americans and cultural ownership had been spoken directly in front of country music royalty. George Strait turned slowly to face the group of young tormentors, his expression remaining calm, but his eyes carrying the steely resolve of a man who had faced down hostile crowds and industry politics throughout his legendary career. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had earned the right to speak on behalf of an entire musical genre. "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation," he said, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "And I think there might be some confusion about what country music really represents. You see, country music has always been about storytelling, about real people facing real struggles with dignity and determination. It's about family, hard work, loss, and hope." The girl with the smartphone had stopped recording, her device hanging limply in her hand as she struggled to process the surreal turn of events. The video she had planned to use for mockery had suddenly become evidence of her own ignorance and cruelty, witnessed by someone whose opinion carried infinitely more weight than her social media followers. "This young man," George continued, gesturing toward Miguel with obvious respect, "just performed my song with more heart and authenticity than I've heard in years. He understands what country music is really about because he's living it. He's supporting his family, honoring his father's memory, and facing adversity with courage. That's country music, regardless of where someone was born or what language they speak at home." The businessman, who had complained about the noise, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly realizing that he had dismissed something genuinely special in favor of his own convenience. Several other passengers who had remained silent during Miguel's harassment began to look ashamed of their inaction, understanding that they had witnessed cruelty and chosen comfort over courage. Miguel remained in stunned silence, unable to fully comprehend that his musical hero was not only defending him, but praising his performance. The validation felt almost too overwhelming to process, especially coming so quickly after the devastating criticism he had endured just moments before. George knelt down to Miguel's level, bringing himself to eye contact with the young performer. "Tell me about your father, son. I can hear in your voice that this music means something deeper to you than just entertainment." Through tears that now flowed freely, Miguel began to share his story in halting English, occasionally switching to Portuguese when emotion overwhelmed his second language skills. He spoke about Roberto's love for country music, about their evening lessons in the kitchen, about how Amarillo by Morning had become their special song, because it represented resilience and determination in the face of adversity. "Papa always. Say that cowboy in the song, he never give up," Miguel explained, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about his father. He fall down, but he get back up. Papa say that's what we do in America. We get back up and keep trying. George listened intently, his own eyes beginning to show emotion as he heard the profound connection between the music and the family's immigrant experience. He understood immediately that Miguel's performance had not been an appropriation of someone else's culture, but rather a genuine embrace of the values and stories that country music represented. "Your father was absolutely right," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "and you're carrying on his legacy in the most beautiful way possible. The cowboy in that song could learn a thing or two from your family's courage." The lead teenager, realizing that continued silence would only make his earlier comments more damning, attempted to salvage the situation with an awkward apology. "Look, Mr. Strait, we didn't mean anything by what we said. We were just, we're big fans of yours too." George stood up slowly, his height and presence seeming to fill the entire car as he addressed the group with measured words. "Being a fan means more than just listening to the music, son. It means understanding and living the values that the music represents. Country music has always welcomed anyone who came to it with an honest heart and genuine respect for the tradition." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Some of the greatest country musicians in history were immigrants or children of immigrants. The genre itself was built by people who faced hardship and found strength in storytelling and community. What I heard from Miguel today embodied those traditions better than anything I've seen in Nashville recently." The girl with the smartphone found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "We're sorry, Mr. Strait. We didn't think about it that way." "Don't apologize to me," George replied firmly. "Apologize to Miguel and his mother. They're the ones you hurt with your words." The three teenagers looked at each other uncomfortably, the weight of their earlier cruelty becoming impossible to ignore under the scrutiny of their musical hero and the other passengers who were now watching their every move. The tall boy stepped forward first, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed Miguel directly. "I'm really sorry for what I said. That was wrong of me. You play really well, and I was being an idiot." His companions followed with their own mumbled apologies, their earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of their public humiliation and the undeniable evidence of their own ignorance about the music they had claimed to defend. Miguel, displaying the grace and maturity that his father had instilled in him, nodded acceptance of their apologies. "Is okay," he said quietly. "Papa always teach me that music bring people together, not push them apart." George smiled at Miguel's response, recognizing the wisdom and character that Roberto had managed to instill in his son, despite their brief time together. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man, Miguel, and he raised a remarkable son." The train began to slow as it approached the next station, and George realized that this magical moment was approaching its natural conclusion. But he had no intention of allowing this encounter to end with just words of encouragement. Something deeper was stirring in his heart, a recognition that this meeting was more than coincidence. "Miguel," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want you and your mother to be my guests tonight. I'm performing at a benefit concert at Madison Square Garden, and I think you might enjoy seeing how Amarillo by morning sounds from a real stage." He handed Lucia 2 tickets, along with a backstage pass that would allow them access to areas of the venue that most fans could only dream of visiting. "There's something special happening here, and I don't think our paths crossed by accident." As the train doors opened and George prepared to exit, he turned back to face the entire car. "Thank you all for witnessing something beautiful today. Remember that talent, heart, and authenticity don't have nationality requirements. They just require an open spirit and genuine love for the music." The subway car erupted in spontaneous applause, as George Strait stepped onto the platform, leaving behind a group of transformed passengers and one young Brazilian boy whose life had just taken an unexpected turn toward destiny. The hours between the subway encounter and the evening concert passed like a surreal dream for Miguel and Lucia. After returning to their modest apartment in Queens, they sat in stunned silence, staring at the tickets and backstage pass that George Strait had placed in their hands. The reality of what had transpired seemed almost too extraordinary to believe, yet the physical evidence lay before them on their small kitchen table. Miguel whispered in Portuguese, his voice filled with awe and disbelief. Is this really happening to us? Lucia reached across the table to touch her son's face gently, her own eyes still wet with tears that had been flowing intermittently since they arrived home. I think your papa is watching over us tonight, meu filho. I can feel his presence in all of this. They had very little time to prepare for such a momentous evening. Their wardrobe consisted primarily of work clothes and school uniforms, nothing that seemed appropriate for a night at Madison Square Garden as personal guests of country music royalty. But Lucia remembered a shirt that Roberto had worn to their wedding 15 years earlier, carefully preserved in their small closet. Though it was slightly too large for Miguel's 12-year-old frame, the white button-down represented the closest thing to formal wear they possessed. As Miguel dressed in his father's shirt, rolling up the sleeves to accommodate his smaller arms, Lucia felt Roberto's presence more strongly than she had since his death. The image of her son, wearing his father's clothes while preparing to fulfill a dream that Roberto could never have imagined, was almost too emotional to bear. Papa would be so proud, she murmured, adjusting Miguel's collar with the same maternal care she had shown Roberto on their wedding day. He always believed that music would open doors for you, but I don't think even he could have imagined doors like this. The journey from Queens to Manhattan felt longer than usual, with every subway stop building anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. Miguel clutched his guitar case throughout the trip, unable to leave behind the instrument that had made their extraordinary encounter possible. Other passengers on the train looked at them curiously, perhaps wondering why a woman in her best cleaning uniform and a young boy in an oversized dress shirt were carrying a guitar case toward the city center on a Tuesday evening. When they emerged from Penn Station and caught their first glimpse of Madison Square Garden, both mother and son stopped walking simultaneously, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the venue that would host their evening of dreams. The iconic arena loomed before them like a temple to music and performance, its marquee proudly announcing George Strait Benefit Concert tonight only. Lines of well-dressed fans stretched around the building, many wearing cowboy hats and Western wear that cost more than Miguel's family spent on groceries in a month. The contrast between their modest appearance and the affluent crowd made them both feel self-conscious, but the backstage pass in Lucia's purse served as their golden ticket to a world they had only glimpsed on television. A security guard examined their credentials with initial skepticism, clearly surprised to see such unlikely VIP guests. But the authenticity of their passes was undeniable, and soon they found themselves being escorted through corridors that buzzed with the controlled chaos of a major concert production. Roadies wheeled equipment past them, technicians spoke into headsets with urgent efficiency, and the air itself seemed electrified with anticipation. The backstage area was a maze of dressing rooms, catering tables, and equipment storage that felt like the inner workings of a magnificent machine designed to create musical magic. Miguel's eyes were wide with wonder as he took in every detail, from the coiled cables snaking across the floor to the sound engineers making final adjustments to massive speaker systems. "Mrs. Silva, Miguel," a voice called out behind them, and they turned to see a woman with a clipboard and an official-looking credential badge approaching them with a warm smile. I'm Sarah, Mr. Strait's tour manager. He's been waiting to see you both." She led them through another corridor to a door marked with a simple star and George Strait's name. When she knocked and announced their arrival, the voice that responded from inside was unmistakably the same Texas drawl that had spoken such kind words to them on the subway just hours earlier. George Strait opened the door himself, having changed from his subway disguise into the crisp Western wear that was his signature look. His presence seemed even more commanding in this environment, yet his smile remained as genuine and warm as it had been in the cramped subway car. "Miguel, Mrs. Silva, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, stepping aside to welcome them into his dressing room. "I have to tell you, I haven't been able to stop thinking about your performance this afternoon. There was something special about it that I can't quite shake." The dressing room was surprisingly modest, decorated with family photos and personal, mementos, rather than the ostentatious displays of wealth that Miguel might have expected. George noticed the boy's guitar case and gestured toward it with interest. "Did you bring your grandfather's guitar? I'd love to take a closer look at it if you don't mind." Miguel carefully removed the instrument from its case, handling it with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. George examined the guitar with the appreciation of someone who understood the value of instruments that carried history and emotion rather than just monetary worth. "This is beautiful," George said, running his fingers along the worn wood. "You can feel the love and music that have flowed through it over the years. Instruments like this have souls, and yours has been well loved." As George handed the guitar back to Miguel, he paused thoughtfully, as if weighing a decision that had been forming in his mind throughout the afternoon. "Miguel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. How would you feel about singing with me tonight in front of 20,000 people?" The question hung in the air like a musical note that seemed to resonate through the very walls of the dressing room. Miguel's mouth opened, but no sound emerged, his young mind struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. Lucia gasped audibly, her hand instinctively reaching for her son's shoulder as if to steady herself against the overwhelming nature of the moment. "I know it's a big stage," George continued, his voice gentle but serious. "And I know you're young. But I've been performing for 45 years, and I recognize something genuine when I hear it. Your performance this afternoon had more authenticity than most of what I hear in Nashville these days." Miguel found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "But Mr. Strait, I'm just a kid who plays in the subway. Those people out there paid a lot of money to see you, not some Brazilian boy who doesn't even speak perfect English." George knelt down to Miguel's level, just as he had done on the subway, his expression serious but encouraging. "Son, let me tell you something about those 20,000 people out there. They came tonight because they love music that tells real stories about real people. You've got a story that needs to be told, and you've got the talent to tell it in a way that will touch their hearts." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Your father believed that music could bring people together, right? Tonight, we have the chance to prove him right on the biggest stage in New York City. What do you think he would want you to do?" The mention of Roberto's belief struck Miguel like lightning, illuminating a truth that seemed to cut through all his fears and self-doubt. His father had always taught him that music was a gift meant to be shared, that talent came with the responsibility to use it in service of something greater than oneself. "He would want me to sing," Miguel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He would want me to show people that music really doesn't have borders or boundaries." George smiled broadly, recognizing the transformation taking place before his eyes as fear gave way to purpose and determination. "That's exactly right. And Mrs. Silva," he said, turning to Lucia, "your husband raised a remarkable young man. Tonight the whole world is going to see what I saw on that subway. A knock on the dressing room door interrupted the moment, followed by Sarah's voice announcing that it was time for George to take the stage. The arena beyond the walls was filled with anticipating fans, their voices creating a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the building's very foundation. George stood up and extended his hand to Miguel. "Are you ready to show them what real country music sounds like?" Miguel took the offered hand, his small fingers disappearing into George's weathered palm. "Yes, sir. I'm ready." As they prepared to leave the dressing room, George paused at the door. "There's just one more thing, Miguel. When we get out there, I want you to sing like your father is listening, because I believe he is." The walk to the stage felt both endless and instantaneous, each step carrying Miguel closer to a moment that would define the rest of his life. The sounds of the crowd grew louder as they approached the wings, and through gaps in the curtains, Miguel caught glimpses of an audience that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. George Strait was about to take the stage for what many of his fans assumed would be a typical, albeit special, benefit concert. None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness the moment when a grieving 12-year-old boy from Brazil would prove that dreams really do come true, and that music truly is the universal language of the human heart. The roar of 20,000 voices created a wall of sound that seemed to physically push against Miguel as he stood in the wings of Madison Square Garden, watching George Strait take the stage to thunderous applause. The arena lights illuminated, an ocean of faces, cowboy hats, and raised hands that stretched as far as the eye could see. The magnitude of the moment threatened to overwhelm the young boy's courage, but he clutched his grandfather's guitar and whispered a prayer in Portuguese, feeling his father's presence stronger than ever. George commanded the stage with the effortless grace of a man who had spent decades perfecting his craft. He opened with 3 of his biggest hits, his voice as smooth and powerful as ever, each song building the crowd's energy to fever pitch. The production was flawless, with lighting and sound that transformed the arena into a cathedral of country music, where every note rang with crystal clarity. "Thank you, New York," George called out during a brief pause between songs, his voice carrying easily to the furthest reaches of the venue. Tonight's benefit concert is for a cause very close to my heart, helping immigrant families who are working to build better lives in America. But before we continue, I want to share something special that happened to me this afternoon. The crowd quieted expectantly, sensing that their idol was about to reveal something personal and meaningful. George's tone became more intimate, as if he was speaking to friends rather than performing for thousands of strangers. "I was riding the subway today, just trying to get across town like any other New Yorker, when I heard something that reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. I heard authentic storytelling, genuine emotion, and a voice that carried the kind of truth that can't be manufactured or taught." He paused, building anticipation, while Miguel waited nervously in the wings, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain everyone around him could hear it. Lucia stood beside him, tears already streaming down her face as she realized her son was about to experience something that would change his life forever. The voice belonged to a 12-year-old boy from Brazil, playing his grandfather's guitar in a subway car, singing my song Amarillo by Morning, with more heart and soul than I've heard in years. His name is Miguel Silva, and he learned to love country music from his father, who passed away 6 months ago in a construction accident. A murmur of emotion rippled through the crowd as George's words painted a picture of loss, resilience, and the healing power of music. Many in the audience had experienced similar tragedies in their own lives, and the universal themes of grief and hope resonated deeply. Miguel's father taught him that music is the universal language, that it brings people together, regardless of where they come from or what language they speak at home. Tonight, I want to prove that Roberto Silva was absolutely right. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Miguel Silva to the stage." The arena erupted in applause as Miguel stepped into the blazing stage lights, his small figure dwarfed by the massive venue, but his spirit undaunted by the challenge before him. He waved shyly to the crowd, overwhelmed by the warmth of their reception and the surreal nature of finding himself on one of the world's most famous stages. George placed a reassuring hand on Miguel's shoulder as they approached the microphones at center stage. "Don't worry about the crowd, son," he said quietly. "Just sing to your father like you did this afternoon." The opening chords of Amarillo by Morning filled the arena, played by George's professional band with a richness and depth that transformed the familiar song into something approaching a sacred hymn. When Miguel began to sing, his young voice soaring clear and true through the massive sound system, the effect on the audience was immediate and profound. 20,000 people fell silent, mesmerized by the pure emotion pouring from the small figure at center stage. Miguel's accent, which had been mocked by teenagers just hours earlier, added a unique beauty to the familiar lyrics, proving that authenticity transcends artificial boundaries of nationality or language. As the song reached its crescendo, George joined his voice with Miguel's, creating a harmony that represented the best of what country music could be when it embraced its core values of inclusion, authenticity, and genuine human connection. The duet was magical, with the veterans' seasoned professionalism perfectly complementing the young boys' raw talent and emotional honesty. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted for several heartbeats before the arena exploded in the loudest ovation many observers had ever heard at Madison Square Garden. The standing ovation seemed to go on forever, with many audience members openly weeping as they witnessed something truly special. But George Strait was not finished with his surprises for the evening. As the applause finally began to subside, he gestured for quiet and approached the microphone with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Folks, what you just witnessed is exactly why I've spent my entire career fighting for authentic country music. Miguel represents everything that's right about this genre, and I believe his story deserves to be heard by the entire world." He turned to face Miguel directly, his next words carrying the weight of a life-changing announcement. "Son, I've been in this business for 45 years, and I've learned to recognize something special when I hear it. What I heard from you today, both in that subway car and here on this stage, is a gift that comes along maybe once in a generation." The arena fell silent again, sensing that something momentous was about to be announced. Miguel looked up at his hero with wide eyes, uncertain what was coming, but knowing that his life was balanced on the edge of transformation. "Miguel Silva," George announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the venue, "I want to offer you a recording contract with my label. I want to help you make an album that honors your father's memory and shares your story with country music fans around the world." The crowd's reaction was explosive, but Miguel's response was even more powerful. The young boy, overwhelmed by emotion and the magnitude of what was being offered, began to cry tears of joy, gratitude, and overwhelming relief. All the struggles of the past 6 months, all the challenges his family had faced, all the dreams that had seemed impossible just hours earlier, suddenly seemed within reach. Lucia, watching from the wings, collapsed into a chair as the full impact of the moment hit her. Her husband's belief in their son's talent, his insistence that music would open doors for Miguel, had been vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. Roberto's dream for his son was coming true on the biggest stage in New York City, but the evening held one final surprise that no one could have anticipated. As Miguel wiped away his tears and prepared to respond to George's incredible offer, a familiar figure appeared at the side of the stage. It was the businessman from the subway, the man who had dismissed Miguel's performance as noise and told him to stop playing. He approached the microphone tentatively, his earlier arrogance replaced by humility and obvious remorse. George, surprised but gracious, handed him the microphone after confirming that he wanted to address the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," the businessman began, his voice shaking with emotion. "I was on that subway car this afternoon. I was the man who told this incredible young artist to stop playing because he was bothering me after my long day at work." A gasp went through the crowd as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a public apology being delivered to a global audience. "I want everyone here to know that I was wrong, completely, utterly wrong. I let my own selfishness and prejudice blind me to something beautiful that was happening right in front of me." He turned to face Miguel directly, his eyes filled with tears of genuine remorse. "Miguel, I'm sorry for dismissing your talent and your tribute to your father. What I heard tonight proves that you have a gift that deserves to be celebrated, not silenced. I hope you can forgive a stubborn old man who learned an important lesson about keeping his heart open to unexpected miracles." The businessman's apology represented more than just personal redemption. It symbolized the power of music to transform hearts and minds, to break down barriers of prejudice and misunderstanding. The audience responded with warm applause, recognizing the courage it took to admit error so publicly. George Strait smiled as he reclaimed the microphone, understanding that the evening had become something far greater than a simple concert. This is exactly what country music is all about, folks. Real people, real emotions, and the courage to admit when we're wrong and grow from our mistakes. As the concert continued with several more songs, Miguel remained on stage, singing backup vocals and experiencing the rush of performing before a massive audience that had embraced him completely. Each song felt like a celebration of his father's memory and a promise of the bright future that lay ahead. When the show finally ended, with confetti falling from the arena ceiling and the crowd on their feet for a final ovation, Miguel knew that his life had been forever changed. The recording contract was just the beginning. George had also arranged for Miguel to receive professional music lessons, ensuring that his raw talent would be properly developed and nurtured. 3 weeks later, the video of Miguel's performance at Madison Square Garden had been viewed over 50 million times across social media platforms. Record labels from Nashville to Los Angeles were calling, talent scouts were reaching out, and Miguel Silva had become the most talked-about young artist in country music. But more importantly for Miguel and Lucia, they had discovered that Roberto's belief in the power of music to transform lives had been prophetic. The struggles were far from over, but they now faced the future with hope, support, and the knowledge that dreams really could come true for those brave enough to pursue them. 6 months after that fateful subway ride, Miguel Silva released his debut single, a touching tribute to his father called Papa's Song, which rocketed to #1 on the country charts and established him as the first Brazilian-American country music sensation. The song's success opened doors for other immigrant artists and proved that authentic storytelling transcends all artificial boundaries. George Strait kept his promise, serving not just as Miguel's mentor, but as a surrogate grandfather figure who guided the young artist through the challenges of sudden fame while ensuring that success never dimmed the authentic spirit that had first captured his attention in a crowded subway car. And somewhere, Roberto Silva's spirit smiled, knowing that his son had honored his memory in the most beautiful way possible, while proving that music truly is the universal language that brings all people together.